member of Congress, because the first congressional, of course, goes from Makapu'u all the way to Ko'olina and up to Mililani Mauka. But as I think we all know, we have two members of Congress on the House side from Hawaii, and although we deal in districts, it doesn't really matter. Nobody pays much attention to that. I pay just as much attention to the second as I do to the first, and vice versa for the members that have represented the second as I once did. So I've seen my mission in three buckets, if I can put it that way. The number one area is my responsibility under the Constitution, which is to provide national leadership, to contribute to national leadership on the great issues of our day, whether it be domestic or foreign policy. My number two mission is to make sure that our federal government is working for us here in Hawaii. So that's a much more Hawaii specific mission. And my job there is to make sure we don't get forgotten and that our needs are addressed and that we tailor federal assistance wherever possible to our own unique circumstances, which oftentimes are truly unique. And the federal government in DC and big marble buildings doesn't always understand that. And then number three, equally important, is my obligation to assist you with your individual concerns, to help folks with their questions about the federal government. Many people have issues with the federal government in one way, shape, or form, whether it be immigration or veterans benefits or any number of things. So those are the three areas that I've focused on. And as Karen pointed out, a lot of my effort is undertaken through my committees. I was incredibly fortunate to get onto the Appropriations Committee, which is the committee that directs virtually all federal funding for our federal government. And so that's a very highly coveted committee, and it's a very valuable committee. It's been decades since any member of the Hawaii delegation served on appropriations over on the House side. So I've definitely been trying to do my best on that committee, not only on a national leadership basis, but also to help Hawaii. My other committee, Natural Resources, is also an invaluable committee, especially when we focus on exactly what it connotes, which is the resources of our country, whether they be air, land, or ocean, which is a particular interest of mine and all of us in Hawaii. But that committee has a lot more jurisdiction than just natural resources. It also has jurisdiction over, for example, the indigenous peoples of our country, to include Native Hawaiians. And of course, representing the district of the most Native Hawaiians of any district in the country, I take that responsibility very, very seriously. I also work through a number of other caucuses and other organizations within Congress. One that I think is maybe of particular interest to you is referred to as the Blue Dog Caucus, which are the Democrats like me who are much more focused and concerned about federal fiscal matters, about the federal debt, about the deficits, but also related about government accountability. How can we make sure that your taxpayer dollars are being spent in the most efficient and effective and directed way? In the Blue Dog Caucus, I'm co-chair of the part of the Blue Dogs that focuses on fiscal responsibility and government reform. So I take a leading role from that perspective in those areas, which is tough nowadays. So that's a big picture. We've tried very hard to keep in touch. I've done frequent newsletters. I've done talk stories. I've talked with you previously in as both the chamber as well as in other responsibilities that you have. We've done everything to keep in touch, and I want to leave you with that, that my website is case.house.gov, and please go there to get in touch with me in my office. Of course, we're dealing with COVID-19. It's hard to believe that it's only been some 8 months since COVID-19 hit us all very, very severely. From a federal perspective, I have tried to work with my colleagues to deal with what I believe are really the three components of COVID-19. Number one, of course, is public health. We simply cannot get anything else done as to COVID-19 without dealing with public health first and foremost. Cannot have an effective economic recovery without stabilizing the COVID-19 public health consequences. Cannot help recovering our social safety net and helping communities with people that are particularly hard hit without first solving public health. And so I've dealt with this first and foremost as a public health crisis, and I believe that's exactly what it is. And I think it's a mistake to treat it as anything else. We have to treat it, number one, as a public health crisis and treat the others, but we can't treat the others without the first. Congress's response to COVID-19 was the CARES Act, initially back in March, a collection of bills that added up to about $3 trillion of federal emergency assistance. Here in Hawaii, I worked very, very, very hard to steer about $9 billion of those monies to various parts of Hawaii, whether it be our state and local governments, our small businesses, certainly through the PPP program, where we were able to provide assistance to roughly 25,000 of our small businesses at about $2.4 billion of assistance. Some of the other small business programs, direct economic impact payments to residents and their families, and then finally, unemployment. It's been a mixed bag, as you all know better than me, because you've been walking point on all of this. The state and local government funding has been oftentimes slow and a little frustrating to get out into communities. I don't have a direct role in that, but I certainly try to track it all the way through to where it's intended. The economic impact payments to residents and families went pretty well. There are still, though, payments that are out there unmade, primarily for those folks out there who, for whatever reason, didn't file federal income tax returns in 18 and 19. Perhaps you just didn't have the income requiring it. And that has taken a little extra effort to get those monies out there. So if you are in that category or know of anybody in that category, you can certainly help. Unemployment, a mess. I think we can all agree on that. I think we can agree that our state government, which administers unemployment as a state program, and I'm not going to pick on them, they were caught flat-footed like many other unemployment offices throughout the country, just overwhelmed. This has been really one of the major areas of great concern for me, is just the raw processing of those claims and the number of very desperate people out there who need this help but have been waiting 12, 16 weeks, maybe longer, for unemployment assistance that they are entitled to. They just have to have some processing, some checking, and so this is clearly unfinished business. And then finally, our medical providers, because they are number one, they are on the front lines. The equipment, PPE, and other assistance initially was very scarce throughout the country, and we had our own issues here in Hawaii in accessing adequately the PPE. The larger hospitals like Queens had their problems, but they solved them fairly quickly. Their bigger concern was the smaller clinics, the independent practitioners, the nursing homes throughout our state who could not get their hands on PPE fast enough or in the volume that they needed to really deal with COVID-19. We saw some very tragic consequences as a result. So much of my effort was directed there. Pretty good progress, but still unfinished business as well. It was obvious to me, and I think a fair number of my colleagues in March and April, that CARES was not going to be enough. And so we started working on our second emergency assistance package, which we passed out of the House on May 15th. And that was about a $2 trillion additional funding, which was directed to some of the same buckets. We tried to massage it in some ways to get it to work better. For example, PPP was not working as we fully intended. We tried to take care of some very, very specific areas that really needed help. For example, our travel and tourism industry, our restaurants, and entertainment related industries were extremely hard hit. And we passed that bill out of the House in May. And unfortunately, that's where it sat and still sits in the Senate, which has had a different view on additional emergency assistance, and to some extent, the president and the administration as well, who have not supported HEROES. And unfortunately, we have been, tragically, I will say, we have been in a very, very difficult negotiation for some months now to try to get that additional emergency assistance out. I thought until a few days ago that we were closing in on that additional emergency assistance and getting it out before the election, which I think we all believe is critical, certainly critical, you know better than me here in Hawaii. But then the president suspended negotiations. I thought an extremely bad move on his part. He is now talking about coming back to the table. So, I don't know if that's just a negotiating tactic, but from my perspective, not a very good negotiating tactic, since his Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Mnuchin, was doing just fine getting to a difficult but nonetheless compromise deal. So I don't know what to say to you right now, because it's such a fluid situation, it's hard to predict. My own view is that we will have another deal, and we will be able to get that emergency assistance out throughout our communities pretty fast, since it's going to follow roughly the same tracks as we've already blazed here. But nonetheless, it's way overdue. And as you know, so many of our communities and businesses and neighbors are over the edge at this point. And so that has to happen very fast. That's been my number one priority. We, of course, have an election in just a few weeks, which is dominating pretty much everything. And remember that it's not just a presidential election that is complicating things, but it is an election in the U.S. Congress where there are very hotly contested seats throughout the entire country. And so elections are a terrible time to have to deal from a national policy perspective with a crisis as severe as COVID-19, but those are the facts that we have in front of us. We have to do it. And so I hope that we do it. We'll find out, which way our country is going in a few weeks, and we'll try to adjust to that as well as possible. I think that a couple of final comments, and then kind of turn this over to you. I think the first thing I would say is that although COVID-19 has dominated my office for 8 months, we obviously have our other job to do, which is everything that we were doing before COVID-19 and have been doing during COVID-19 and have to do and will do after COVID-19, whenever that is. Foremost, there is the annual appropriations process, where I pay a lot of attention to trying to make sure that the areas that I think Hawaii needs are adequately funded, whether it be our industries or whether it be our military community, whether it be our social services communities, our scientific communities, our education communities. These are all areas that are impacted by the annual. So it's unlike the state of Hawaii. We go through this once a year, not once every 2 years. The annual appropriations process. We had a very good, solid appropriations result this year, but we're already working on next year, of course. And so, and there are other examples of that. Foreign policy remains a top priority. So as I look down the road after the election, and of course, although this isn't a campaign event, I am a candidate today, so I'm not taking for granted that I'm going back to Congress representing you. But assuming that I am going back to Congress representing you for now, my agenda is number one, COVID-19. Nothing's going to change. Between now and the election, very little is going to change immediately after the election. This is a long road. We have to make the progress that we can when we can get it, and forge those compromises to get help out to where it's needed. Make the right decisions at the federal, state, and local levels that will, fairly and reasonably and accurately balance public health against economic consequence to our communities. The areas that I would particularly focus on besides COVID-19 going on out into another 2-year term in Congress, from my perspective, are how do we solve polarization? Just because Biden or Trump is our next president, or the House or the Senate is Democrat or Republican, polarization is not going to disappear. We all have a responsibility for that. I've certainly done my part, but it's going to require a lot more. Given where the polarization is going, and there's going to be incredible temptation by the quote unquote winners to take advantage of their win, and there's going to be incredible disappointment on the part of the quote unquote losers. And you've got to find a way to bridge that, because otherwise you end up in a divided country, not just a polarized country. And I don't want to live there. National debt and deficits, always on my mind. We have to incur the debt and deficits that we are incurring right now. That's why the federal government is there. One would have hoped that in good times we would have gotten ourselves in better shape so that we'd set aside money for our rainy day. We didn't do that. And so our debt and deficit are much worse today, obviously, than they were at the beginning of the year, and they were pretty bad at the beginning of the year. And then finally, I would say that here in Hawaii, of course, besides working very hard on our principal and other economies, whether it be tourism or military, construction, small business, very conscious of the role of small business in Hawaii, education, a number of other industries. My focus is on Hawaii's role in the Indo-Pacific because the Indo-Pacific is becoming far more critical to our country and to our world. I spent a lot of time with Indo-PACOM itself, trying to figure out how we can help. From our perspective in Hawaii, that's not only, from my perspective, our obligation to our country, but let's not forget that our military is our second largest economic pillar. And it has been a stable pillar through an incredible crisis as tourism tanked. And so we have to recognize that as we do our job for our country, there is also a benefit for us here in Hawaii. And this is a time when our military needs much more support from our community. And so I would leave you with that. Stay in touch, please. That's my quick summary, probably longer than I wanted to go, but I hope it was of some benefit and will answer some of your questions. But I appreciate very much the opportunity of being able to serve you. Over the last 20 plus months. I've got 3 more months on my current term. I look forward to working with you into the future. Again, case.house.gov, we're here to help. Mahalo.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for the great update and just brief. I know things are changing constantly, as you mentioned, on Capitol Hill, and we just appreciate being here today. And we've got a list of questions to share with you. We did collect questions in from our members prior to today, so I'm going to start off with those 2. And then for those of you on today's webinar, we also have a Q&A. I know some of you have populated some questions, and we'll get to those after we go through these initial questions that were submitted. So, but again, thank you for the overview. The first question that we have is relating to the CARES Act money you mentioned that we received earlier this year. You know, those monies, of course, are needed to be expended by December 31st. And the question is, what is the likelihood that Congress would give the states an extension to extend the CARES Act money beyond that date?
Yeah, so just to clarify and get everybody on the same page, the CARES Act, which is the only law that we have enacted at this point, that's the $3 trillion, and of that CARES Act funding, $1 trillion plus went straight to state and county governments. Here in Hawaii, it was $1.25 billion that went to the state and to the city and county of Honolulu. The state and the city both shared some of their money with the other counties who are not technically entitled to it under that law. And that money is to be expended isn't exactly the right word. Obligated would be a better word. But it's got to get pretty far down the road to being actually spent by December 31st. And of course, when we passed this back in March, we thought, hey, this is an emergency. We want this to be spent now. This is not something you stock away for 2 to 4 years from now. Spend it or lose it to give everybody an incentive to do it. I think that was the right decision, but it's been far more problematic for some states and counties to get that money kind of out there. It's not like you can snap your finger and spend $1.25 billion, in a very short period of time, unless you cut a lot of corners, which I don't think is the right thing to do. And so the money that the state of Hawaii and the city and county of Honolulu has to at least be obligated. I strongly believe that deadline should be extended. Actually, most of my colleagues feel the same way in the Congress. This is part of our HEROES Act. It is also part of a smaller version of the HEROES Act that we passed 10 days ago. actually less than 10 days ago. I think it was actually about, it was the last thing that I voted on before I came home. And so all of those would extend it. The problem is not that we all agree on it. The problem is passing a law that actually says it at this point. So that back to the point of the Senate not wanting to move on the HEROES Act and the president not wanting to move on it either. Although today I understand he has now said he's going to go back to the table. So I'm sorry we had to go through this for the last couple of days, but you know, I'm not going to fault him for saying he's coming back to the table. I think we all need to get back to the table. So I believe that whether a additional federal emergency assistance package is passed before or after the election, there will be an extension. The real problem is that you have to, you know, you don't just get up to December 31st and then decide whether to obligate and spend money or not. You have to have a little bit of a lead time. So we have put our state and county governments in a very difficult situation right about now, where they have to, you know, decide whether to go in one direction or another direction, or what to do in order to obligate and spend these monies. So it's not a pretty situation for them to be in. But I do think that we will be able to extend it for them.
Great. Well, the next question actually piggybacks off of what you just said. One of our members asked, how do we kickstart economic recovery here in Hawaii? And what do you think the best path for our local government is to work with businesses to help? You know, beyond, of course, what we've been discussing with the CARES and HEROES Act.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think one thing I would say in that respect is that I view my role as a full partner to my colleagues in state and local government. So I don't think of my job as, you know, I'm in the Congress federal bubble and I never interact with the state and local governments. Frankly, that does occur in some places, but it's never been my style. If I can work with the mayor, the governor, even when I might disagree with them on some of the things that they might do, I'm still going to work with them. I'm still going to talk it through with them. And so I've been in very, very close contact with, you know, the governor, the mayor, the other county mayors, the city council members on this island, the state legislators, my colleagues in public service, to coordinate, to try to say, what do you need? How can we, you know, maximize the resources that are available? How can I get you the federal assistance that you need? What's the hang up in spending the CARES Act money, and how can I fix that? Sometimes there's a fix from Washington, D.C. So I say that as a kind of a prelude, because the question said, you know, was, what do I think state and local government can do? And frankly, I think it's about what we can all do. From my perspective, it is about federal emergency assistance across the board, because I think that that is the only entity that can deliver the level of assistance throughout our country at the breadth and depth that is needed to at least provide some stability in a national economic, speaking about economic in this case, crisis, in order to stabilize things so that we can get public health under control, so that we can reopen our economies, and so that our businesses and our private economic activity can start to regenerate again. And so that's the number one thing that I can do for the state and local governments to work with them, is to encourage them to continue to access federal funds and other resources. Sometimes they're not just funds. Sometimes you change a regulation. You haven't actually appropriated anything, but you have materially improve the situation for state and local governments. And so that's the number one thing that I can contribute to that, is keep working with us. Number two, kind of a point that I made earlier, and none of this I think is rocket science. I think the state and local governments, again, have to keep public safety and public health first, because if that's not stabilized, then it is going to be very difficult to reopen our tourism economy, our small businesses, our restaurants, our entertainment venues, especially the parts of our economy that are heavily dependent upon people moving around and interacting. If we don't get that under control, we can reopen. We can reopen, but I think that we would face a very, very high risk a relapse at that point, which would look a lot like some of the states on the mainland that reopened, I think, a little bit too fast without taking care of the public health side. So the actual implementation of the concept is where the problem is. I think we would all agree that we need to get public health under control, and as we do, we can start to relax the restrictions that are public health related. So that's clearly where we need to do. I have a role in that because so many of the areas of public health, not to mention economic, are federally related. For example, I'll just give you one example and then stop. I believe we have to test people before they get on airplanes. I've been saying that for 6 months now, that the quarantine was ineffective and risked public health and risked confidence in the many visitors who want to come to a safe place. They felt that the quarantine was ineffective and the safe place wasn't so safe, they're not going to come. So that's an area that I can directly help from a public health perspective. There's other things that we can talk about over the midterm to the long term. I don't think there's any, better example of our failure to diversify our economy, and it bothers me greatly that when our economy is great, when we should think about and invest in diversification, we don't. But it's only like when it tanks, like right now, that all of a sudden we all throw up our hands and go, wow, I wish we could have diversified. So that's not going to do anything for COVID-19 in the next months, which is where the focus has to be. But clearly, over the midterm, long term, it does have to be about insulation from shocks that are related to pandemics or to disruptions, economic disruptions that we've written on tourism's rise and fall based on economic and worldwide disruptions for a long time. You would think that we could have learned the lesson at this point, but that's for another day.
Well, thank you. And it's interesting. The next question that we have is shifting away directly from the CARES Act funding, but it directs somewhat to what you just spoke of. We look at diversification, but we also have to look at moving things forward, just in general. And so one of the questions that came up was in regards to our infrastructure. It says, what is the current state of federal highways funding for Hawaii, and what are the prospects of an infrastructure bill after the election? And of course, we here in Kapolei are specifically interested in that with our growth. We need that infrastructure in our, roads and sewers and everything else in between to be able to continue to grow into the second city we want to become. So we share that question with you.
Fully understood and agreed. And, again, I've spent time in, Kapolei. I have been through the same traffic as everybody else. I have, sign waved on my political side on the sides of the roads at rush hour in the morning and at night, and just to kind of occupy my mind, actually counted the number of cars that went by me in a certain period of time and did my calculations, and I'm well aware of the incredible infrastructure needs of a still growing second city, and a still growing city that where infrastructure is not caught up or kept up with growth. And so it is very much one of my responsibilities. In terms of federal highway funds, first of all, they are still going out. They have not been impacted by COVID-19. They are still going to the state, to the counties to some extent, but primarily to the state in large amounts. So there's nothing that's been disrupted from that perspective. And in fact, on the broader level, I think when we take a look at the three stools of our economy right now, the main stools, tourism, military, construction, there are lots of other stools, but those three account for the majority of our economic stability and activity. Two of those three stools are still going. So construction is still proceeding. I would be worried about construction in a year or two, when people that were proceeding with projects now may defer that, but the projects that were underway during COVID are in the pipeline and to financing. They're obviously going forward, many of them in Kapolei. And of course, we've talked about the military, and I'm not gonna downplay the importance of that. So I'll mention that a number of times probably. But from the highway perspective, the money is still there. We do believe that one of the midterm to long-term solutions for COVID-19 is a massive infrastructure bill of the kind that we don't see more than once in a generation. By the way, this is one of the areas where pretty much everybody's on the same page. Republican, Democrat, the president himself has said, let's do an infrastructure bill. We took him up on that, and in the House passed out a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill, which would mean billions of dollars of additional monies to Hawaii. That was not passed out of the Senate, unfortunately. I think that that's unfinished business, and we'll go back to that in the next Congress. So it's a very, very good question, and I think it illustrates that both in the middle of a crisis and when you're not in the middle of a crisis, there's some things that get a lot of attention that always end up in the media, but there's a ton that's going on behind the scenes in terms of just grinding away at making sure that federal funding gets to the right places in Hawaii or anywhere else in the country. Programs are working. So highways is definitely one of them.
Well, thank you. Before we go back to the COVID-19 related questions, I had another question that came up and directed towards rail. Our members asking, what impact does the city's withdrawal from participating in rail's P3 have on the FTA funding, the federal funding?
Well, there's two things. There's two things that have potential negative impacts on the FTA funding. And again, let's set the stage. Recall that rail is participating under an agreed, appropriated, the money is already there, agreement with the federal government. 1.5 billion of rail's budget is federally funded, of which, and I'm rounding these figures, 750 million is already paid. What we want is the next $750 million. That has been due, well, arguably due for some time. The federal government has expressed concern over budget and behind schedule costs over the last couple of years, and has been much more tight with Hart and the city and county in terms of a realistic budget. And there are two elements of that budget that the recent developments impact. Number one, and we don't know this yet because the bids are not public and they cannot be public. But every indication seems to be that those bids came in substantially above expectations, and thus substantially above budget. Number one. And number two, the fact that the city is now moving to not participate in the P3, and the city council, as a matter of fact, is now moving not to commit city monies, that's got to have an impact on FTA. Now, it doesn't have an impact yet. FTA and the congressional delegation generally, and I personally, have spent a lot of time with FTA trying to keep FTA on track for that $750 million. But when you take a budget that you had to scrub and clean up and was subject to a lot of scrutiny by FTA, and then you tell FTA, this is our budget, which relies on contributions from government in part, and put it together with revenues which assume a pretty active tourism industry, and then you also say to them, we're going to go in the direction of P3, and these are our numbers on P3, and none of that works out, you're obviously going to have an issue. Now, I don't think it's fatal at all. I don't think FTA wants this project to fail. There are many, many projects out there that are endangered in one way, shape, or form. Not endangered, that's the wrong word, but in distress, I would say, as a result of COVID-19. So we're not alone in the country. And the country still wants to finance these mass transit projects through Congress. So I won't say that, I'm not throwing up my hands and going, the sky is falling, but it's not a positive, these are not positive developments. So there's going to be a lot of work necessary to keep FTA on track to release the the remainder of the federal funds, which are budgeted into that project, not just the big picture of the project, but as anybody that's in construction, knows, you're not just talking about the total cost, you're talking about the phasing of the cost and where you're going to get the money for each of those phases. And the FTA money is definitely targeted to earlier on in those phasings.
No, thank you. Yes, and we are impacted on that subject from multiple angles because of the downturn, of course, with the tourism. That'll be a big job for our next mayor to tackle as well. But going back to,
by the way, I really apologize. I really apologize. This is not as exciting as a mayor's debate, So yeah, I'm sorry. It's just, I guess I could have debated myself.
No, these are huge topics. I mean, we may not even get through all the questions, and I want to say that too. Any questions that we don't get through today in our timeline, I'll certainly get some answers from Congressman Case and get it out to our members. But moving on to back to the CARES funding, we had a member that wrote in. He says, would you be able to provide some federal oversight with regard to use and distribute of the CARES funds of the state and county, specifically Honolulu? And this member says, there's a number of requests for assistance that are not being addressed or processed properly. And I know you spoke about working together with our local government in depth. There was also a question that was on our Q&A today regarding the Department of Health, and it's somewhat in the same vein. Speaking of, just the dysfunctional bureaucracy that, was that came about, and so just kind of on those two fronts, to our local governments, what would you be able to provide, or is there a possibility of federal oversight or assistance with that?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, I would agree with the general sentiment, not just in Hawaii, but throughout the country, that again, the concerns expressed, which I think are legitimate. Hawaii is not the only state and county out there that is going through many of these things. Many states and counties out there, again, I'll say it, got caught flat-footed and were not able to respond quickly enough. This is a national emergency, and it takes a lot of foresight and a lot of investment to be able to see a crisis before it's actually in front of you and to be prepared for it. The unemployment insurance here is a perfect example of that, because we've known for a long, long time that we had an antiquated computer system for unemployment that was decades old. We've known that it would never handle a true crunch, and hey, welcome to the true crunch. This is the consequence of not investing. So, but that's no excuse. So a couple of comments. First of all, much of the CARES Act funding is discretionary to the state and local governments. They can, in fact, decide what to do with it, the state and local government funding. And we did that on purpose because we felt, and I agree with this, because we felt, you can't micromanage this from the federal government in DC. Some states, some local governments need something that others don't. So you shouldn't tie their hands so much. But that's no excuse. The exercise of discretion is no excuse for, dragging your feet in terms of making those decisions and getting that money out. So in that area, certainly I have, again, spent a great deal of time with state and local governments to track each of the programs that were the CARES Act funding. There are about 75, 76 separate federal programs of funding that need to be tracked. Not all of them state and local government, but a fair number of them influence. So we've got to go through that process. I would also say that we do have federal oversight. Besides my more informal oversight, we have formal oversight committees in Congress to watch the distribution of CARES Act monies. Again, it's a big job. A lot of money is out there in a very short period of time. But we are trying to oversee those funds, and we have in fact pursued what we feel are abuses of the use of those funds, or people dragging their feet for that matter. And then the last thing I would say is, if you are aware of specific areas where you don't think that the state, it's one thing to defer on a decision as to how to make those allocations, which again I don't think people should do, but arguably it's within their discretion. It's another thing to actually misuse those funds. So I'm more concerned I'm more concerned relatively about the misuse of funds, the alleged misuse of funds for purposes that we didn't authorize. So if those are out there, please let me know, and I'll do my own oversight on them.
Thank you. There was actually a question regarding that, and with reference to the PPP loan that came recently. Of course, the local business leader was arrested for PPP fraud, and so actually, one of our members, specifically asked about that. As this comes up, there are going to be, unfortunately, some misuse of funds. It's unfortunate that happens, but this member asked, what, if any, preventative measures are being taken to avoid that type of fraud, loan fraud, for example, and to ensure, if we have a second set of funds that are dispersed in that manner, are there preventive measures now that this is, and from what I understand, this isn't an isolated case. This has happened across the country in different areas as well, unfortunately.
Well, a couple of answers to that question. The Justice Department has actually charged about 57 people across the country with pretty acute, alleged fraud, and the case here in Hawaii is one of 57. So, in one respect, it's it's not isolated. There has been fraud in the program, not acceptable at all. And so clearly criminal review and criminal investigation and prosecution where necessary is completely relevant. And the folks that the federal government and the Justice Department in particular are reviewing all of the loan applications for PPP for possible commonality in terms of fraud, so it might be identified. Now, I think the vast majority of PPP applications and loans and grants were completely legitimate. And I think people didn't go out there to rip off the government by and large. And I think that banks that reviewed those loans didn't go out there to cut corners. My experience with the Hawaii banks were they were very good about it, very businesslike. However, when you throw that amount of money out there in a very short period of time, and you try to accelerate it because an economy is failing, not just businesses, an economy is failing, and you basically say that we are going to loosen some of these requirements and rely on people's honesty a little bit more to self-report without what a bank would normally do as verification, and then for the federal government to relieve those banks of liability, which is what we did to get the banks to do it on these terms. You're going to have some fraud, and so we have to prosecute that. Very, very, very difficult. But it should be no surprise that there was some fraud. I hope it's contained. I believe it is. I certainly don't have a sense that it's widespread in Hawaii among the 25,000 businesses that got those PPP loans. And I think it was an absolutely indispensable program. But if there's fraud out there, it should be prosecuted.
Great, thank you. We've got about close to 10 minutes left, but I've got going to kind of switch back to the topic that you had just spoken about earlier, and that is testing. You had mentioned you have been supportive, since the beginning on testing before people get on a plane to come across to the ocean to come here. So the question was, what actions are being taken to ensure the flow of testing supplies and PPEs across the U.S. Is being dispersed in a fair and equitable manner, and just to avoid a bidding war of supply for these supplies?
It was definitely an issue early in the pandemic, and because Hawaii is a smaller state with a smaller population, and because we did not have significant cases of COVID those supplies were diverted elsewhere. And it was very, very concerning to me and the rest of our delegation. In fact, we wrote to the president directly and said, hey, you can't just, divert everything. You can't penalize Hawaii because we have been good. We were good at the time. This is the first time around for doing the right things from a public health perspective. Now, I don't think it ever got to a really acute situation here, as, for example, it definitely did in New York City, for example. Even a large city like that, the scope of needs and the PPE available did cause bidding wars. You had the governors of New Jersey and New York bidding against each other for the same PPE. That was not good. And a couple of things that we did, I think, were the right things to do. I think, first of all, the government did put together a much more coordinated response through FEMA primarily and HIEMA here in Hawaii, where we tried to identify the real acute needs throughout Hawaii and get the available PPE to acute areas. The other thing we did was to say to businesses that manufacture or imported PPE, look, we're basically going to cockroach half of your PPE and allocate it based on need, and the other half subject to need. You can allocate perhaps through a normal market. That helped a little bit. The other thing that we were very, very slow to do, and I think the president was in error on this, was that we did not trigger the national law that requires domestic manufacturers to start manufacturing specific product for national emergency needs. That law was out there. The president was slow to trigger it. So we didn't start up our domestic manufacturing capability early enough, but it now has started. And so I think we're in a much better place from that situation. Now there are still needs. I still hear from I mentioned, care homes earlier. I mentioned, smaller clinics, especially on the neighbor islands, who have difficulty getting PPE. We have helped them very specifically on an individual basis to find PPE. So if you're in one of those situations and you're not getting your PPE, let us know and maybe we can find it for you.
Great, thank you. Shifting over to, testing is about to happen next week on every person who gets, before they get on a plane to come here. Our tourism industry, obviously, on the west side, we have Ko'olina that's been affected, and then even broader, we have thousands of our residents who have been furloughed or are unemployed because of it. But, to give a boost to our tourism and to push things forward, what legislation, if any, has been proposed to aid our tourism industry? What's on the table for that?
Well, I'm deep into that because, of course, Hawaii is a tourism state. We're not the only tourism state. For example, I have colleagues in Congress from Nevada who are just as interested as I am in travel and tourism nationally, and we cooperate with each other. We have a travel and tourism caucus in the United States House, which is bipartisan. The Senate has the same, so we all cooperate with each other to help national travel and tourism, which by some estimates employed somewhere up to 1 in 10 of all workers in our country, if you view travel and tourism in a broad sense to include entertainment, the airlines, attractions, restaurants, etc. So this is a major industry, and it has been the most devastated industry in our entire country. And we're just part of that. We have the highest unemployment in the country right now, at close somewhere in the range of 20%, depending on how you count. But we're clearly the highest, and Nevada is number 2, and the others that are equally high or almost as high are travel and tourism locations. So there's a lot to deal with on an emergency basis. CARES did focus on much of travel and tourism. PPP, for example, small business related, was about travel and tourism because throughout the country, not just Hawaii, small business is a much more major part of the industry than in many other industries. Manufacturing industries, for example, some of it in the distribution, but it's not really a small business delivery industry. Tourism is. And so as we help the small business, we help the travel and tourism. We also help the very specific parts of tourism, for example, $50 billion to the airline industry. In the Heroes update that we just passed a week ago, we also went $100 billion to the restaurant industry. These are all about travel and tourism. These aren't just, you know, abstract thoughts. There's a direct relationship to travel and tourism. So and again, I would make this point. I'm your congressman, and I am directly responsible for the federal government. There are many, many decisions that can be made and should be made at the state and local levels that can significantly and do significantly impact travel and tourism. But I'm not the governor, I'm not the mayor, I'm not a council member, I'm a US congressman, and I can work with them to make sure that the federal government contributes, but I'm speaking more on the level of the federal side of things because that's my kuleana, my direct kuleana. So these are short-term solutions to try to stabilize travel and tourism so that you know, those travel and tourism related businesses that are on the edge and without assistance, they will fail if they haven't already in the next, you know, few months. But we also have kind of a midterm, long-term challenge in front of us, which is to muster a coordinated federal response for travel and tourism on a national level. Would you believe that of the top G20 countries in the world, we're the only one that does not have a cabinet or sub-cabinet level office devoted to travel and tourism? There's no assistant secretary for travel and tourism in our country. We're the third, by some accounts, largest travel and tourism, first to third, depending on your measure. Economic activity, first, as I recall, third in terms of arrivals, overseas arrivals we're talking about. So we should have this department, and we're gonna need it going forward. Not only that, but we're gonna need to coordinate all kinds of stuff. We're gonna need to coordinate visa requirements, which are too restrictive. We're gonna need to coordinate, you know, national marketing efforts. We're gonna need to coordinate federal funding. And so just last week, as a matter of fact, I co-introduced in the House a major travel and tourism proposal, which we refer to as the Visit America Act. It is a counterpart to a Senate bill that was introduced by Republican and Democratic senators, including Brian Schatz. So, you know, Hawaii is in there twice out of the 7 people that co-introduced this bill. On a bipartisan, bicameral basis, 2 of us are from Hawaii, which should be no surprise. So I'm trying to chase this from a short-term perspective, the aid that needs to go to travel and tourism now. I'm trying to chase it from an appropriations perspective, which is how can I get the federal funding in the short to midterm, and then a long-term perspective, which is how can we best coordinate the federal big picture recovery plan for travel and tourism, and then how can we translate that into what we need here in Hawaii?
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful to hear. We'll be watching that as it hopefully moves forward. We've got a couple minutes left, and I'd like to shift gears to one more set of questions. There's 2 that I'm going to tie together, and it's directly relating to the upcoming general election. You know, interesting, there's just a lot happening, and these are kind of topics of the day. And the one that we had from yesterday's news was, you know, the country seemingly very divided, the recent plot to kidnap a state governor. What do you feel the winner of the upcoming election needs to do to unite our country and calm the political landscape? And how will you work with the other candidates to make this happen? I mean, huge divide. We were talking about that throughout your conversation with us today. But if you can give us some perspective on that, that'd be great.
Well, if I was elected president, which is never going to happen, first things that I would do after being elected, the very first thing I would do would be to give a speech to all Americans. I would not treat it as a partisan victory. I would treat it as an opportunity to reach across divides immediately, and I would outlaw the rhetoric of partisan divide. Now, there's nothing wrong with great policy debates even great policy debates that break down long partisan lines. That's what parties are for. They articulate, they refine, they ripen, they crystallize policy differences. We have policy differences that are largely partisan in healthcare. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't have to talk about those policy differences in a personal, accusatory, divisive way that and a way that twists facts that accelerates divide. And so the next president needs to just get use a tone of unification, not ceding the policy differences or decisions. You don't have to do that. You shouldn't do that. But we need to find our common ground. I think that I think that there are lots of examples of this, and one of our past presidents, who I guess I won't name because that'll be partisan in and of itself, said there's nothing wrong with America that cannot be fixed by what is right with America, and I think that's right. And so number one is the approach. Number two, I would bring people of all parties into my cabinet. I would make if my administration ends up just being Republicans or just being Democrats, well then that leaves everybody out. And then number three, I would go out there and take the biggest issues of the day: healthcare, public, taxes, federal spending, COVID-19 relief, and I would just full on try to develop consensus solutions to each of those using people from all parts of the United States. In Congress, same basic idea. Now there's lots of, despite what everybody reads and hears and sees in the media, you would think that Congress was a hopelessly partisan, hopelessly divided institution, and it is way too partisan, way too divided. However, there are lots of opportunities if that is your motivation to start with. I'm a member of a number of bipartisan caucuses. I just talked about the Visit America Act, which is a completely bipartisan initiative, bicameral, meaning House and Senate, Republican and Democrat. I believe that many of the issues that we face are going to have to be solved on a nonpartisan basis. So I'm going to have to make partisan decisions. I will. I have no problem doing that. However, when I have the opportunity, then I'm going to try to do that. I formed, for example, I know we're running out of time, but I formed a caucus. I founded a caucus this year called the Pacific Islands Caucus, which is a group of members of Congress that are focused exclusively on our country's policy to the Pacific Ocean. Now that's our backyard, so it's a natural for me. However, I believe that's where the future of our country and our world are going to be determined. So we better focus on it a little bit more. Now, my caucus co-chairs, the people I founded it with, they're Republicans and Democrats on purpose. I didn't form the Democratic Pacific Islands Caucus. That would be self-defeating from my perspective. I'm trying to forge consensus. So there's lots of opportunities, but we all have to do it. And unfortunately, coming out of this election, as I said earlier, there's going to be a ton of temptation for winners to be winners and losers to be losers, and that's the wrong way to try to heal a country.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Well, we are up on the 12 o'clock hour, but I just wanted to thank you, Congressman, for taking the time to speak with us. We're going to post this recording live on our Facebook later, and then on our Facebook page, and then we'll also be sharing it with our members. That and if there's any questions that we didn't get to, we can certainly work to get them answered. But we appreciate you taking the time. We hope we can carry on this conversation in the future too. I know that you have a deep caring for our West Side, and you've been to our events that we've had. We hope to get to those someday again soon, live events, and get back to the normal we all want. But we appreciate all of the support and your time today and sharing all this insight. Lots of questions answered, and we appreciate it. Mahalo.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure that there are lots of questions that we didn't get to. Please email me if ed.case@mail.house.gov, ed.case. And we'll try to get them answered. I definitely look forward to continuing to work with each and all of you. And again, I would say if we can help you out at all with your questions, your comments, your your thoughts, whatever it might be, case.house.gov. So there you go. Thank you very much. Aloha.
All right. All right. Thank you, Congressman. And thank you for all that attended today. We'll be sending out a follow-up email, and we have another talk story next week with Queens Medical Center, Dr. Ron Kuroda. So mahalo. Have a great day, everyone. Take care. Aloha.